Good afternoon. My name is Andres Martinez. I'm the co-director of our Future Tense initiative here at New America. Future Tense is a partnership between the New America Foundation, Slate Magazine, and Arizona State University. You all were treated to a wonderful marketing or propaganda video of ASU before we got started. And I should say that in addition to making those great videos, ASU is at the forefront of a lot of great thinking in the country about the marriage between science and humanism and philosophy. And this Future Tense partnership has been very enriching to New America and to Slate Magazine because of the likes of Brad Allenby and Dan Surowitz, who are here with us from ASU today, and the leadership of Michael Crow at ASU. Today's topic is really about a different marriage, which is our marriage as individuals and humans with this onslaught of exhilarating, sometimes frustrating technologies that increasingly are enhancing our humanity and sometimes even defining it in different ways and perhaps undermining it. So to explore this topic of how we interplay with these technologies and that fraught relationship, we thought, what better than to bring in a fantastic advice columnist from Slate Magazine, Emily Yoffe, who writes Dear Prudence. And so she is going to lead a conversation with Brad Allenby and Dan Sarowitz, who've written a book on this fraught marriage. And let me give you the formal quick bios, sketches. Brad Allenby is a Lincoln professor of engineering and ethics and a professor of law at Arizona State University. Brad is sitting in the middle here. He has written extensively about design for the environment, earth systems, and engineering management, industrial ecology, nano and biotechnology, and technological evolution. Dr. Allenby previously spent more than 20 years working for AT&T, where he served as vice president for environment, health, and safety. Dan Sarowitz, to the left here, is the co-director for the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes, as well as a professor of science and policy at ASU. His work focuses on understanding the connections between scientific research and social outcomes and on making policies to strengthen these connections. He is the author of Frontiers of Illusion, Science, Technology, and the Politics of Progress. And both Brad and Dan co-authored the focus of today's book, which is The Techno-Human Condition. And Brad and Dan have been sort of touring the country, engaging audiences on this subject of how we engage with technology. So when you walked in, you probably were given a piece of paper where you should feel free. We please encourage you to fill out questions that we'll gather near the half point of today's session, and that's questions that our panel can take up. And the issue is, these questions, we'd like you to frame them as questions to an advice columnist on your own relationship to technologies in your life. And they can be anything from, your frustrations at being so addicted to your BlackBerry, or broader sort of philosophical questions about how the definition of what it means to be human might be changing in this day and age. Last note on a housekeeping matter, bear in mind that this event is being webcast, and so when we do go to a comments and questions session, please wait for the microphone and identify yourself, and enjoy lunch, and thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to open up with Brad and Dan kind of giving an overview on this subject, and then Emily's going to take over and moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Write legibly, please.
Yes, right.
Thanks, Andreas. So maybe I should first, as a factual correction, say our Whirlwind book tour was actually on mostly AM talk radio shows where we just call in from our basements at ungodly hours, depending on what time zone it is, to places like the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and the Oklahoma Panhandle. So
it had its charm.
It had its charm. It was not as romantic as touring in an old '62 Corvette, which was Brad's idea. But anyway, so let me just set the stage here in terms of kind of laying out the landscape that we occupy. And I don't think this is that far from people's intuitions or understanding, but I think it's important to just kind of make sure we all start from the same place. So who here has received childhood vaccinations? Okay, so everybody. All right, so your immune systems are enhanced, right? I mean, every one of you is already a design space for bioscience via, for example, childhood vaccinations. How many of you have outsourced your memory? So if I said how many of you use Google, you'd all raise your hand, right? So especially those of us over 40 who are no longer able to remember other people's names, let alone our own. I mean, one way to look at Google is it is the expansion of our cognitive function into this incredible space that allows us to pretty much remember everything we ever knew and ever could have possibly forgotten. All right, now, So, how many of you know someone, right, who's ever used an off-label drug like Ritalin or modafinil to enhance your concentration, your ability to stay awake? I know someone, right, and you didn't inhale. Okay, so now this suddenly raises interesting questions, right, because Brad and I teach, and we all know that lots of our students use these performance enhancers. We don't necessarily know which ones. Should we mark those people on a curve? Is it unfair? Who's to decide what's appropriate in terms of preparing for a class, doing your homework, taking some drugs? Caffeine's okay, right? So suddenly the landscape gets a little funny, and you begin to get into questions of what is appropriate, what's normal, what's not normal, who gets to do what. We try to formalize some of this stuff through, say, sports, right? Oh, not okay to do steroids. Everyone does steroids. Not okay to do steroids. Eventually, what might have at one point seemed to be an unethical transgression in an attempt to gain an advantage over others suddenly becomes the norm. So all questions about what's right and what's wrong, questions about who's normal and who isn't, all of these things are up for grabs because of technological change. People know who Oscar Pistorius is, right? The South African runner, double amputee, fabulous bionic legs, can basically run at the speeds that allows him to compete as an Olympian, all right? Who's prepared to have their legs amputated so that they can get those kind of bionic legs so they can be in the Olympics? Why not? How is it different from, say, going to an orthodontist to make your teeth look like everyone else's teeth? So again, the technological capabilities are in weird and uncomfortable ways changing the ethical space. They're changing the space in terms of the definition of what's technological and what's human. They're changing the space they're changing the way we think about what's normal and what's not normal. So, this is what makes the techno-human relationship so complicated, troubling, exhilarating was a word Andreas used, also scary. And it destabilizes the very kind of ground that we're used for navigating, that we use to navigate our way through society and through our days, because simple questions like what's ethical and what isn't, what's human and what isn't, what's natural and what isn't, are no longer things that we can make easy sense of and that are continually subject to change as a result of technological innovation. So let me stop there as kind of a way to suggest what the landscape is that we're trying to navigate, and turn it over to Brad.
And let me begin by asking if the tape can roll. Hello? Yes. So with apologies for the sound, the point remains that there is a fundamental difference between an ape holding a bone and an ape that knows it's holding a weapon. Just as there is a difference between me holding a cell phone and somebody who's a digital native holding an iPhone that knows how to use it and what to do with it. They are competent in the world today, and I am not. points out, I think, a couple of things to bear in mind as we have this discussion. The first is we'll be talking about a lot of things, but virtually none of them are new. I think that there are things that are different today, and those need to be understood. One difference is that the rate of technological evolution is accelerating perhaps far more rapidly than it ever has before, because technology is autocatalytic, it feeds on itself. And so as we get more and more rapid evolution of technology, there comes a point when psychologically and institutionally we are incapable of keeping up with it. Whether or not you think that point has arrived is something we can talk about as we go on. But it is clear that the challenge of technology is very profound today, partially because there is more and more of it and it is changing faster and faster. And any technology system of any power whatsoever fundamentally destabilizes ourselves, our cultures, our communities, and our society. The second is that technology more and more is enabling us to design the human. Now, as that bone suggested, we have always done that. When you first printed a book, you were changing what humans are in very profound ways that really haven't been looked at closely enough from that perspective. But now we are able to change more dimensions of the human more rapidly and more fundamentally than we have before. So you have a design process being run by entities which are themselves part of redesigning the entities doing the design process. Good luck with that one. Now, in general, our response has been twofold. And I grossly oversimplify these, so I suspect virtually everybody in the audience is going to be upset with me. We can talk about that later, or better yet, you can address relevant questions to Dan. One approach is the libertarian approach. And the libertarian approach basically says, look, I should be able to do what I want with my own body. And that works, except it overlooks the fact that these technologies all have network effects as they ripple through community and society. As Dan says, if one person in my SAT class enhances, then I'm okay. That doesn't really perturb anything, and I'll do just fine. 25%, and it begins to skew the curve. 50%, and if I don't enhance, I'm the new subnormal. So enhancements are not free of implications for everybody else in the society that is playing with enhancements. The second thing I think is the opposite approach, which tends to be the conservative approach, that you shouldn't enhance at all because there is a human nature and a yuck factor, and what those indicate is that enhancement beyond a very minimal level is inappropriate. Now, the problem with this is a very practical one. I come from Scottsdale, and I think that at least half of Scottsdale's GDP comes from doing enhancements on people that involve physical attributes that are probably not functionally required. People like to enhance. And if it's your kid that's enhancing, and if you think you will give your child a competitive advantage in life, they'll be more intelligent, they'll be better looking, they'll be better athletes. The pressure to enhance is going to be very profound. So the problem with the conservative approach is it requires that the state stop people from doing what they want to do. That's a different kind of problem, but I think it has similar issues as a libertarian approach. Our argument would be that both of those approaches are oversimplistic, and of course I have simplified them in presenting them, but we really haven't gotten to the point where we're developing sophisticated responses to the challenges of the technologies that we've already got, much less the ones that we're getting. And I think where this leaves me is in a very simple place. You want the future? You can't handle the future. But it's coming anyway. And in fact, it's already here. Over to you.
First of all, I want to say you need to join the 21st century and replace your 2001 clip with a clip from The Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which is a terrific movie for all of you interested in technology that very nicely kind of reverses the tale of evolution and explains how the apes took over. But anyway, thank you so much, both of you. I'm here to talk about, from a non-technological perspective, the issues you raised, because from my dear Prudence mailbox, and I'm not a technology person, but I'm forced to grapple all the time with human dilemmas that come out of the interface between human relationships and technology. So let me start with one, probably my most common question in my inbox. My boyfriend, husband, is addicted to online porn. And it used to be that to get access to porn was not necessarily easy. It was kind of embarrassing, stealthy, plain brown wrappers, etc. Now you can say, honey, I'm going to look at refinancing the house and spend the evening on YouPorn and see more naked people doing things than humans in history have ever seen. When I first started getting this question, I tended to take a fairly liberal approach, as long as it's. I was struck. There was a study. A researcher in England wanted to do a study looking at men who never looked at porn and men who look at porn. He was not able to do it because he could not find a man who hadn't looked at porn. So
Brad hasn't.
Pardon me?
Brad has not.
I look at pictures of cars.
Right, auto porn.
We'll maybe leave that aside.
Okay, I don't like that term.
So I tended to take a fairly liberal approach. All men do it. Don't pay any attention as long as it's not interfering with your marriage. But I do, it actually has made me start to wonder if, in fact, the nature of it, that there's no limit on it, doesn't itself change the experience, doesn't itself take the lid off, doesn't itself make it obsessive, and then change the most intimate part of a marriage. The wife feels his sexual energy is somewhere else. I'm not as enhanced as the women he's obsessed with. And, I'm more baffled now how to answer that question. So
we'll give you an abstract and obscure academic way to think about it.
You
so
could
don't have to be baffled.
do that.
But
Go.
yeah, you've really set the bar either very high or very low here. I'm going to start off with. So, the first thing to say, obviously, is how no one expected this no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. No one expects universal access to pornography when, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Program Agency, was developing the internet, right? So part of this has to do with the general approach to technology, which is promiscuous. First we do things and then we figure out how to react. The second is one I do think has to adopt a position of some acceptance for pervasive changes. If everybody's doing it, it's reality. And so then the question is, what are the appropriate norms and ethics to guide behavior? And maybe there's a big upside to this. Maybe things that were taboo and that we couldn't talk about now become so normal, so banal, that in fact we can stop objectifying each other and can simply recognize this as a life function that we can talk about without squirming. So my point is that that's necessarily what's going to happen. It's that the landscape is completely different, and we have to accept that landscape and try to understand how to manage it rather than wishing that it would go away. So it's the new reality. If everyone's doing it, there's no avoiding it. Maybe there's something good to come out of this because it forces us to address something that was obviously there.
And to follow up on that, I think that one needs to understand the socially beneficial dimensions of porn. Many of the telecommunications and information advances that we all take for granted occur because pornography drives the market. Your ability to use charge cards as easily as you do on the internet comes from the fact that the porn people had to figure out how to get paid.
Wow.
It's a secret that most communications companies don't talk about much, but what drives innovation is porn and copyright violation. I should point out that not only do I no longer work for AT&T, but my chances of ever doing anything for them again are down the tubes. The second is, so one of the things to ask if we find things about people that we don't like is whether at some point we might want to think about designing them out. This raises a whole set of issues that I encourage you to think about. I'm not going to say much more about them because first, that's way over the horizon. And secondly, a lot of these kinds of characteristics are associated with other patterns of behavior. So pornography, for example, may well be associated with male aggression, which has been a driver in some cases for cultural innovation, and in other cases for very bad things like conflict. My suggestion would be that we need to rise to a level of sophistication in trying to understand the human that we haven't begun to achieve, in part because we're working with ideas that we're dragging out from the 18th and 17th centuries, and they fail. Give an example. The problem with porn, the way it is rolling out now, is that it illustrates two parts of the world, at least, that aren't going to go away. The first is these technologies are very powerful, and we're going to make them very much more powerful. So if you think porn is a problem now, you wait until we start getting really good 3D, before we start getting really good physics engines, before the sound becomes really excellent, and what you're going to see is extraordinarily... Not to mention what?
Odorama.
I am
Don't
not
mention
going
it,
there.
please.
Right, not to mention it. We're going to make, we being society as a whole, are going to make these very, very powerful and attractive technologies. We already have kids in virtually every school in the country that drop out because they become addicted to gaming. That's going to become much more of a problem. These information technologies are extraordinarily powerful, and we really haven't begun to think at all about them in the way that we need to address questions like this. A final point is, you recall that the CEO of Google has pointed out that we produce as much information in 2 or 3 years today as was created in the entire history of civilization up until that point. The information structures that we are dealing with are profoundly different, and they have changed virtually every aspect of our society, and we haven't begun to think about that. Porn is an obvious one. What happens to a relationship that is based on a scarcity of information when suddenly there is a huge abundance of information? What happens to a society when there was a scarcity of cultural framing? Think the United States in the 1950s, and suddenly we have an overabundance. The Fox News nation and the New York Times nation are very different. They're ring-fenced from each other. There is more than enough information to support both of them and many, many others. We've fragmented in an information sense, and that is not going to change. What are you going to do about it?
Well, let me pick up on what you said about how addictive these technologies are, because that's another continuing problem. I mean, we heard a bunch of phones go off. We didn't say, please turn off your cell phone. We can understand why pornography in and of itself is addictive. But as you said, just having technology is so powerfully addictive. I mean, you know, my inbox is constantly filled with letters about people. Essentially, you can boil down to the question to, my spouse prefers his or her smartphone to me. You know, and we've all, and etiquette is changing. It used to be, you know, when you had a phone here, if you were in a meeting and it rang and you picked it up and turned, how much ruder can you get? Now people describe going to business meetings where everyone puts their phone on the table. There's no trying to hide it. And, oh, you know. So could you talk a little bit about what is that addictive quality? And as you say, kids would rather drop out of school and play games, just live their whole lives online. If you look at most of the text or whatever you're looking at, most of them are extremely banal. It's not information you need at the time, and yet we're driven to, there's something thrilling about the notification, some other little bit of information has come in. So how does society handle this? Do we need to start changing etiquette the way we change smoking etiquette? Limiting technology, or is it too late? We're just going to have to accept that we're here and also somewhere else through our technology.
Yes, I mean, so part of the question is how do you distinguish what matters from what really doesn't? It's not that etiquette and norms aren't constantly in flux. I mean, you know, think about the furor over Marlon Brando and The Wild One, or, you know, I mean, the Beatles were once a threat to what counted as, you know, being nice and normal, which is almost incomprehensible. So partly there's simply the kind of ebb and flow of what's okay and what's not. But how do you distinguish that from, how do you have conversations about the difference between that and things that are truly socially destructive? So I don't want to be, I'm a dilettante in so many ways. I'm not going to become a pop sociologist on this stuff too, just for the occasion. But so, thank you, Joel. So, but I think the point is that we're not used to having conversations about where we're going to set limits on using technology. We have mostly taken a libertarian approach to it, which is it's all good, we'll accept it, we're going to go with the flow. And I think partly what needs to happen is as things become more transformational, as the pace of change continues to increase, as we feel more and more uncomfortable, we need ways to start talking about this stuff and deciding what matters and what doesn't. And I think that's beginning to happen, but we don't really have any formal structures for doing it. So I guess all I'd say is part of this is just what we have to put up with, and we have to decide which parts of it are more important than that and have the conversation.
Do you, in your classes, do you tell students turn off your technology? You know, you can't be using your phone, or if they're taking notes on a laptop, do you have any way of knowing whether they're taking notes or playing games?
No way of knowing.
And I do know professors that ask that students turn off their laptops in their class, which is the rough equivalent of asking students to go in and turn off part of their cognition. I don't want you to use your memory in this class. And part of it reflects the fact that the professors are themselves obsolete because the cognitive patterns of the kids have changed so significantly that most professors at most universities in this country are obsolete. I'm really popular in staff meetings. But of course, it's true. And
Thank God for tenure.
Yeah, well, there you go. Just guaranteed to make me obsolete. I think one of the questions is it addictive or is it human? I mean, nobody, well, in the movie, of course, the monolith told the ape that he could turn it into a weapon, but nobody told our younger generation that Facebook was going to be a really, really neat social networking technology. It's only 7 or 8 years old. Nobody had to tell them that. They knew that. They understood it. They understood it the way the ape understood swinging the weapon. The technology is a part of being human, and that's the whole point. What the technology does is it becomes profoundly destabilizing of the old patterns that we have built up. Classic case of this is Facebook, right? So every large company that I'm familiar with uses Facebook as part of their hiring process. They do a screen, and when they see that picture of you dancing on a table in inadequate clothing, they view it negatively. Now, every one of those, I don't care if they're 50 or 60, take my word for it, every one of those people probably was dancing on tables when they were young. But there were no cell phones, there was no Facebook to deploy the information and to keep the information on the net. There were no friends who would snap pictures of you and put it on and then tag you as being in the picture. So you didn't have the same kind of information structure then as you do now. The human behavior hasn't changed. What has changed is, and what is unfortunate, is that we have older people who are coupled into old and obsolete patterns of thinking and understanding what kinds of information are acceptable and not acceptable, mixing with young people who have very different patterns but are of necessity being oppressed by the older generation.
I'm so glad you brought up Facebook. That was going to be my next question. How many people here have a Facebook page? Okay, great. Almost everyone. I consider myself a Facebook pioneer now. It was 4-something years ago. When Facebook first opened up to beyond college students, I actually became aware of it. I started to get questions into my mailbox. I remember one of the first ones was, I'm in college, I'm dating a guy there, his mother's a professor, and she friended me, and now she can see everything I post. This is so hard. And I had no idea what she was talking about. What was she talking about? And so these letters started to come in, and so as a Slate experiment, I went as one of the first 50-somethings to join Facebook to see if I could find any friends. No friends. They said, go to your high school, go to your college, alumni associate. Nothing. Tori Bosch was you're my first, and yes, you are one of my, I managed in spending 2 weeks trying to get friends. I got maybe 5 or 6 friends. My Slate colleague Tori here friended me. It was beyond my imagining that in such a short time it would turn into what it's turned into. You know, it's ubiquitous. And I remembered thinking at the time, this will be really interesting for young people because they're going to have a different experience than we did. They're never going to be let go of people in their lives. Their elementary school classmates will follow them their entire lives. You know, why go to high school reunions? You can see everyone's haircut every day. And I just didn't think it would become the mass phenomenon it is. Can you talk a little bit more about how Facebook is changing things, the good and the bad? And I'm starting to hear a little more from young people that they're finding it actually somewhat oppressive. I'm getting questions now from people in their 20s. Can I get rid of some of the people I went to college with who I don't necessarily want knowing everything that's going on in my life, and I sure don't care about them anymore? So how do you see, I mean, you're in touch with young people. How do you see Facebook evolving? What's the good and ill of being under constant social display?
Well, I think I think it would amuse all of my students if I purported to speak for them. I think they would find that pretty hysterical, frankly, because they are different. I mean, you know, you have to be careful how you interpret fMRIs, but if you took an fMRI of me and you took an fMRI of a digital native.
This is seeing inside your brain as it's working.
You would find that they are wired differently than I am. Different parts of their brain have integrated technologies in ways that I can replicate to some extent because we are fairly plastic even at my age. But I can't ever become as good as they are.
Is this your supposition, or there actually we've done studies?
We've done these. What you have to be careful in how you interpret fMRIs, because the fact that you see a physical difference, that it's hard to translate that into, you know, is it a serious one or isn't it, or what? So you have to be careful how you interpret it. But we do know that they're wired differently because they are connected into technologies in ways that I can never be. Mm-hmm. So to that extent, I have to be careful in how I speak about them. What I've noticed is that people my age, and age is not an absolute determinant here, so this is a generalization, bear with me, but people my age tend to get stressed from information overload in ways that younger people don't. And what that translates into is some of their responses may be to parts of the information structure, and then I interpret it as being they're stressed because they're getting too much information. Most of them will not tell me they're getting too much information. They may have a problem with it in another way, but their problem isn't the same problem that mine would be. And I think we're
Can you give an example? I mean, what's the, how do you see
Well,
this?
their problem may be, for example, that they've run into people who are monopolizing their Facebook dialogue in ways that they don't like, or they may be teased or bullied or whatever on Facebook. Their problem is generally not Facebook itself in the same way it is for me. I'm on email. I think email gives me more than enough grief. I'm also on Facebook. The way that I manage Facebook in response to your question about unfriending people and friending them and telling people whose relationship you're in and whatever, is I simply don't do anything on Facebook. So I go for weeks and then I go to Facebook and everybody has done what they've done and I just go on. And which is not what a 20-something would do. So it's a very different way to use the technology. And I think we need to be careful always in thinking about how younger people in particular are adopting the technologies, because we tend to impose our perspective on them. The games are just stupid. I hear that a lot from older audiences. They have no idea what World of Warcraft is like, or EVE Online, or Second Life.
So let me just add a couple things to that. One is that there is a kind of unavoidable non-consensualness to the way that changes in big social phenomena entrain us so that we can't escape them. I mean, I hate email beyond all describing, but I cannot survive without it. I have no choice. So, I mean, this is an example of simply a technology that restructures society and communication, and you know, you have to suck it up if you want to be part of society. So, in some sense, it's like, well, stop whining. It's just reality. But there's another aspect of this too that I think is that Brad and I talk a lot about in our book, which is that we tend to go to technologies because they do something very concrete. They allow us to communicate with a bunch of our friends. And we never think about what the next level of complexity might be. Oops, there goes privacy. You know, and you see this all the time. Automobiles, great, get from point A to point B. Oops, you know, there goes traffic, climate change. We approach technologies with this kind of naivete that they're just a little tool for accomplishing what it is that we want. This is the libertarian view, without ever thinking through what the large-scale consequences might be. So, you know, part of our plea is it's possible to think through some. You can't predict, you can't control, but it's possible to think through some of this stuff early. It really wouldn't have been that much of a surprise to have gone from the initial exponential explosion of YouTube to saying, all right, here's another big threat to individual privacy. Be careful what you post. By the way, I don't have a Facebook page. But I am continually pestered by people from 6th grade, which I find very irritating. So you know, again, this is about parsing the difference between phenomena that we simply have to just embrace because they're part of social change and things that we actually can push back on if we choose to do so.
Well, you know, as you spoke about, these kids are having pictures of themselves dancing on bar stools and not thinking about it, and then old fogies don't hire them. I tend to think that is going to change. It's going to be like you couldn't become president if you were divorced. You couldn't become president if you had smoked marijuana. You couldn't get, you know, a lot of jobs if you had drug use. Then a new generation moves in, and it's not even an issue. So do you agree that at some point when everyone has pictures of themselves dancing drunkenly on bar stools, it just won't be an issue? Or will, in fact, these kids have to learn to pull it back? I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I'm constantly looking at her Facebook page thinking, well, I mean, you could get a job in the porn industry maybe. You know, these photos, she and her, I mean, they go up to their bedrooms and do photo studio shoots, and but she says everyone has them, and if I look at her friends' Facebook pages. They all do have them. So
It might be a requirement for employment.
Well, I think that's part of a constant social negotiation that's always gone on. I mean, kids were negotiating with their parents about Elvis Presley. I think what's the challenge is that as soon as this generation of students gets to be the HR managers for Hewlett-Packard and IBM and everybody else, there's going to be something completely new and completely different and even more challenging, because the rate of technological evolution is not going to slow down to give our institutions time to adjust in a graceful manner as we always have done, sometimes not so graceful. So I think the real challenge is that it's not just a specific issue. We talk in terms of these stories because it makes it real. But the underlying reality is that there is fundamental and transition and seriously transactional change going on across the entire frontier of technology, and that is not going to stop unless something serious crashes. So I don't think Facebook is going to be a problem in 10 or 15 years simply because it's going to be wiped out by something else. What that will be, I have no idea. Now, we've been kind of negative, but I want to drop a positive in here. One of the things that interested me at one point was the behavior on Second Life, which is a virtual reality. And it turns out that there's a lot of cross-dressing on Second Life. Most of it males dressing as females. And the reason, and this is all hypothetical because I don't think there have been any good studies.
Can you just explain, I'm sure a lot of you know what just explain briefly what Second Life is.
Second Life is a virtual reality that is essentially, it's not a game space so much as it is a virtual space where people do pretty much what they do in this space. They build houses, they go to concerts, they don't. There's a lot more sexuality in the virtual worlds than there is in real life.
So you create an avatar.
You create an avatar, an image of yourself, and this image is you in this virtual world.
And do they have sex with each other?
Absolutely they do, all the time.
Is that cheating? I get that question. My husband is having sex with, he's an avatar, and he's having sex with another avatar.
This is another area where the law and culture have not been able to keep up with the technology. Couple of cases. There was one case where a man not only had very ostentatious relationships with a well-endowed avatar, but then married the avatar, and his real-world life sued for divorce. And the question is...
He and the avatar had a ceremony on Second Life?
On Second Life, in virtual reality.
And his actual wife divorced him and
well,
used that
she
as
sued for divorce. And so the first question is, what's the grounds for divorce? Is it adultery or not? And what the court finally decided was, well, you know what? We really do not want to think about this, so we're going to call it abandonment. Basically, the idea was he was spending so much time in Second Life with his virtual partner that he wasn't spending enough time in real life with her, and that constituted abandonment. So that's the way that came out. But notice the way that you were taking ideas that were applicable in the 50s and trying to stretch them to cover something that they clearly do not cover.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be so lurid. I mean, I know someone who
divorced
her husband because he spent too much time on his BlackBerry. So well, I mean, the point is, in some sense...
you know someone whose marriage broke down over his BlackBerry use.
Well, at least that was her 30-second explanation to me. Yeah. So maybe there were other issues. You would know for sure. But I mean, the point is, to some extent, there's nothing new about many of these themes, right? They just manifest in different ways, and it just makes me want to say that it's easy to maybe be a little to gloss over this is just changing norms, and in the future, everyone will know that everyone dances naked on the table for their Facebook page. But the problem is the here and now is that people can't get jobs as a result, and that raises very real questions about how you decide what's okay and what isn't. And these are the conversations that don't get had in advance, and I think that's because people don't take technology seriously as a shaper of society. So while I'm confident along with Brad that part of this is there's just a social catching up process. The discomfort is in the here and now, and that's what we have to address.
Let me ask the audience, just show of hands. If your spouse, significant other was on Second Life and you're like, fine, just have fun, then you found out all his or her time was having sex with the other avatar, raise your hand if you would consider that cheating on you. Okay, so most people, no. Most people, no. I actually did, I don't know enough about Second Life, and I did have a Second Life question, and the wife was angry about all this, and I said, for goodness sake, it's a little cartoon character. And I got slammed down very hard in the comments section saying, you obviously know nothing about Second Life, which was true, and saying, this is a lot more serious than you realize.
It is all about line drawing, though, right? What about fantasies? Are those okay? What about fantasies when you're with your spouse? Is that okay? What about porn?
It's about when your lines have failed, is what it is. I mean, so a lot of men cross-dress in Second Life.
Did we think we'd end up talking about this?
No, I didn't. And one of the reasons...
This is the book we should have written.
It would have sold more. One of the reasons that men cross-dress in Second Life far more than women, and I'm told you can tell by looking at the hair and the shoes, but...
It's because they can.
Well, no, it's because in the real world, women can adopt some masculine affectations without being significantly damaged. But for a male to adopt female affectations in most cultures is still very, very difficult. So men practice with their female elements on a place like Second Life because they can get away with it. They're anonymous, and it gives them a chance to expand their idea of selfhood. That's an argument that I've heard, and I think there's something to that. The counter to that, of course, is that there's a lot of one-dimensional behavior in virtual worlds precisely because people are trying to push that aspect of their personality as far as they can.
Carl Jung would love Second Life, right? Your anima. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I didn't know that,
Archetypes.
and I mean, from a feminist perspective, it sounds pretty great for men to put on the role of female and really try to experience that. So I'm going to say yes to Second Life. Only if you take the opposite sex and then, okay. You Dan, you raised the question. You said you don't have a Facebook page. Is one obligated to keep up? I am an appless person. I don't have a smartphone. I don't have any apps in my life. So I'm always feeling, and I ask people at Slate because they're all young and up on the technology, is this the moment where I turn into my grandmother when she used to call my answering machine, hello, Emily, and it's, the voice on my answer, hello, are you, so I'm always worried, I don't tweet, I don't have apps, and I'm old enough that I remember seeing the first ads for answering machines, and our whole family looked at this and said, who needs an answering machine? You call, if they're not there, they don't answer the phone. What's the problem? What's this answering machine for? So obviously, things, you can't function without an email, et cetera. But can we draw some lines and say, I'm never going to tweet, or will, in fact, it turn out you don't know about back to school night, you don't know what's going on with your kids, you don't, are we obligated to keep up and adopt all the new technologies?
I think it's mostly it's very pragmatic, right? If you have to do it to know when back to school night is, then you have to do it, So, I guess I don't see that as a kind of ethical question. I think, and this does get to the kind of non-consensualness of technological change and the way it sweeps us all along. But, interestingly, at certain times, people sort of rise up, not consciously, but almost just as a sort of mysterious phenomena to reject particular types of technologies. And
Like what? Do you have?
like European rejection of genetically modified foods, like American rejection of nuclear power. So it's not that it's impossible, but it's very difficult to imagine it done in a kind of a systematic way. So I guess my feeling is one has to be fairly willing to realize that so, you know, who objects to weather, right? I mean, we might not like it, but you don't say, damn, you know, I'm going to do something about this hot weather in Washington unless you're going to move, or you go into an air-conditioned building. I mean, in many ways, there is an element of technological change that's like that, and this is kind of techno-human conditioned stuff, right? It's you know, we like to look at it as outside of ourselves, and since it's our own creation, we like to think we can control it. Well, that's crap. We can't. There's things we can control. There's ways we can be smarter about it, but at certain points, social phenomena that are related to technological change are as absolutely kind of fundamental as the weather, as an earthquake, you know, as cultural mores that you can't go against. And so there's an acceptance thing here that we have to deal with too.
Right, but that's the question. You just become obnoxious if
Yeah.
When I was the room mother when my daughter was in kindergarten, you know, I'd have to send notices to everyone, and there were two mothers who said, "Oh, I don't have email," and I was, if you think I'm going to call you every time I want you to bring a muffin in, you're out of your mind. So, I mean,
Yeah. So, but I mean, there's social space, and then it kind of goes away, right? It used to be you really could let your dog crap on your neighbor's front yard and they couldn't say anything. You know, now you can, I don't know, report them or whatever. They'll be a bad person. So I, you know, again, I think that it's a mistake to try to look at this as something over which we have considerable control. There's a lot that and there are these periods where things are being negotiated. It wasn't inevitable that everyone was going to end up having to answer email. It just, you know, if things had evolved in different ways, then it could have been different. But at this point, it's you know, it's as real as the oxygen in the room.
let me just, before you get to that, maybe we should talk about primitive technology, write your questions on a piece of paper, for goodness sake. Start to gather up some questions if people have them.
So I think one of the ways to think about this also is to think about Microsoft, right? I mean, Microsoft keeps advancing and makes its stuff backward compatible, but you reach a point where you're just not backwards compatible. An individual moving through a world of rapid change is a little bit like Microsoft. I mean, my problem is I can't be a digital native because I can't focus on the technology here and now. I have to go back and be backwards compatible with the answering machine, the beginning, DOS even. I mean, you know, so at some point what happens is my backward compatibility catches up with me and I become obsolete. And part of the danger in any society is always that the people in power become obsolete in a way that damages the ability of people coming up to be what they could be.
Yep.
Can you
let me quickly just follow up with that because you know, part of the sort of technological enhancement agenda, right, is life extension, and the fantasy is that we all get to be the way we are until we're 120. But there's an alternative view of that. If you want to know what it is, read the third book of Gulliver's Travels, which describes what a world with people who can live forever is actually like. And it's just an extension of what Brad was saying, radical disenfranchisement from what's going on. So, you know, this is one of those things that we actually could start thinking through now if we wanted. What do we want our commitment to radical life extension to be? Okay, we're not there yet. Lots of people are working on it. Is that what we want?
And what it does is it raises very interesting questions about intergenerational equity, number one, but not from the way we're always used to thinking about it. It raises serious questions about the ability of people, by the time they get to positions of authority, to actually be damaging to society and the kids underneath them because of the way they impose their values. And so one of the areas that I think we need to talk a little bit about is, to what extent are we, as the dominant generation right now, able to, A, and B, entitled to impose our values on the people that are coming up behind us? Because that's what we're doing in many different ways. I think there's arguments both ways. Such as the Facebook issue, right? Well, what I'm saying when I don't consider that person for employment is, anybody who dances on a table in their underwear and gets their picture taken and then puts it up on Facebook so it's all across the internet is not somebody I want representing IBM. Well, horse feathers. I did the same thing when I was young. I just didn't get caught. So, and the more I live, what?
I said that's a scary thought, Brad.
It was a lot better when I was younger. And,
So you say.
and the longer I live, the more I become a problem. So I mean, one of the things that I challenge my students with is the fact I want them to understand why they want me to die. And they seem to like it when it's formulated that way. And there are good reasons for it. There are good reasons for me to die. I not only clear out a place for them to move into so that they can be what they want, but I also become less of an impediment to kids who, for example, grew up with Facebook, grew up with social networks, grew up with virtual realities, are incredibly good at it. I'm less of an impediment for their ability to turn that into what they can actually be as a human being.
So this is a great example of the kind of two levels of technology thing, right? So everyone wants to live to be 150, right? But what is a world where everyone lives to 150 going to be like? And those are the kinds of conversations we need to start having if we really want to be able to manage what we're doing to ourselves.
Can we start getting that 150 entrained pretty soon?
Yeah, right. So we want an exemption. Is that what
Yeah, yeah.
I don't.
Okay, let me start taking some questions. And this question goes to something that I was going to bring up, and I think you've talked a little bit about, Brad. Dear Prudence, I basically outsourced my entire brain to technology, memory, vocabulary, spelling. It seems I should be more clear-headed, but I'm increasingly distracted and confused. Why? And let me add that you talked about you get an old person and a young person in a functional MRI machine, and their brain lights up all differently, and the kids are able to absorb information a different way. I think there was a study out of Stanford that sought to look at how they asked people who were able to use multiple technology, multitask, because I have no vocabulary, really effectively. So they were looking at them. It turns out the multitaskers were disasters. They weren't doing anything well. They were just completely self-deluded. And the conclusion was, our brain is our brain, and no matter if young people's brains are lighting up differently, they're not absorbing information effectively if they're also on Facebook.
I'm highly skeptical of studies like that.
Okay.
What I've generally found is if somebody's over 40 and they do a study on multitasking, they show that it's a disaster. And if they're under 40, they show that it's highly effective. And I think both of those are orthogonal to the real point. The real point is, why do people multitask? And the answer is because there's far more information in the world than there ever has been, and it's coming at them in far more different directions. And if you're a linear thinker like I am, you're incompetent in a world like that. Multitasking is an adaptation of our brain to a much more information-dense world. Now, whether you like it or not, whether it has effects or not, all of those are important questions. But you've got to begin by understanding why it is happening. And it's happening precisely because it's adaptive in the world that younger people tend to find themselves in. Now, remember, we're talking about younger people in developed countries and all the caveats. But my take on multitasking is that to ask whether it's good or bad is a question that ought to follow understanding why it's happening in the first place and what the alternative is. The alternative is that you get somebody like me who, like the person in the note, ends up confused when they get into an information-dense environment. Well, if I'm a kid, I can't afford that because that's my life. I got to be able to handle it. And that's what multitasking does. So the Stanford study to me is sort of like taking English literature and going to somebody in Russia and saying, I'm going to try to see how well you understand language by asking you questions about Dickens.
Yeah, but I also think it's a mistake to assume that everything is always up for grabs. Okay, so it may be true that in an information-dense environment, navigating that is going to require an ability to deal with many different types of inputs. But it is likely also true that people who can communicate effectively through written words are going to be effective at certain tasks, and that's not going to change. And writing well takes time, takes thought, takes choosing the appropriate words to communicate what it is you need to communicate. So it's not that everything gets obliterated. There will still be skills that need to be honed and exercised, and that people will be able to master, to set themselves apart in the world. So I think it's not that that all core functionality of human beings is contingent and is going to change, but we don't know what the relative is. A liberal arts education going to be something that's really going to serve people well 50 years from now, or even now in the traditional sense? I guess I'd like to think that it is. We'll find out. But I do think it's too simple to just assume that everything gets swept away and that things that used to be of value are no longer going to prove to be of value.
But the problem is precisely that nobody asked the question that you just asked, right? So I teach engineering, and most of my peers teach the way they learned it. And the problem is nobody has gone back and asked the question, how much of what you're teaching these kids is A, already being done by a machine someplace, or B, can be done by people who have a fairly simple technical education and will do it for 1/10 of the price. So what I'm doing potentially, if I'm not careful, is I'm educating a bunch of students to fail, and to fail miserably. And the reason I'm doing it is precisely because I haven't asked the question, what is going to be relevant 10 or 20 years from now? What do you really need to know as a human being? That question needs to be asked and answered. And the problem is that there's too many people that just say, well, because they don't think like me, obviously they're incompetent. I don't buy it. I think kids these days are doing fine in the environment they're in. And I think a lot of the problem is that the adults that purport to be studying them are insufficiently attentive to what those kids are thinking and doing, what their life is, what's their cognition.
That brings me to a question which is kind of a cri de coeur from a young person here, maybe saying something opposite of what you're saying. Dear professors, one thing you haven't addressed is, I cannot multitask. This is a question okay, I'll get to that. I'm a young professional and feel most of my worth professionally is based on my ability to leverage emerging technologies. How has new technology changed the value of young people in the workplace? What about the future? And can I ask, if you don't mind, the person who wrote this? Okay. Do you feel, they're hiring me because I know, or hey, what about me as a person? I'm someone beyond someone who can just, the older people can say, can you show me how to?
I don't personally feel that way, but I have many friends who are hired for jobs such as social media consultants or experts, and they're often using, placing content that the organization is creating on spaces where it's handing people. So, and that's sort of like their job rather than the actual content creation. So, I guess I'm just thinking like my friends and I, as well, as we sort of move up kind of the professional ladder, and new technologies are being developed kind of essentially for a younger target audience, like how does that impact my work as a professional?
I think that's a great question, and it gets back to how older people look at, these young kids, let's set them, playing with the toys that we don't really understand, and there's some sense of, there's some other more important stuff going on that we're being left out of.
Yeah, I mean, this maybe is putting your question in too literal a space, and to some extent this is beyond what we ought to be discussing. But we actually have no idea what the effects of the information age are going to be on the future of jobs and employment. I mean, is the hollowing out of manufacturing jobs and corporations in this country just a temporary phenomenon, or are we just shifting over to China? Or is this really an irreversible change where pretty much everything's going to move into the service industry and creating content is basically going to be the most we'll ever be able to do? We have no idea. Nobody's thought it through. And not only that, a lot of dogma has prevented us from talking about it. The dogma of innovation and economic growth and globalism has made it really unacceptable to ask the kinds of questions you're asking. What is the future of work going to be like for us? We don't know, haven't thought it through. There's a lot of theories on both sides, some cataclysmic, some optimistic. But I'm sorry, it's like we don't know.
Can we as a society think it through? I mean, part of what you've said is that technology washes over us. 5 years ago probably, young people weren't saying, you know what, when I get out of college, I want to be the social technology person at DuPont. It didn't exist. So
some things you can
you
think
plan it, or
about.
the technology happens and we change?
No, some things you can think about. I mean, following up on what Dan said, if you're only trained in a specific focal area, and that focal area involves information that can be explicitly structured, then somebody is going to figure out how to put it in an expert system at some point, and you better be careful. If you're educated in something like that, but you have a broad ability to communicate and to understand and structure and perceive and respond to problems in multiple domains, you're going to be much, much harder to replace. So I mean, there are some indications that that kind of broader thinker will do well so long as they keep track of what's going on around them and don't let themselves become obsolete. One of the hardest things that happened at AT&T was we got blindsided by a shift from telephone technology to internet protocol technology, which from an engineering viewpoint are two very different technologies. And we ended up with highly trained engineers that were obsolete, that had no job prospects.
Could they retool, or
they could, but many of them didn't, because they thought of themselves as engineers, and they thought that future-proofed them. And that turned out to be a very, very dangerous assumption.
And this gets to very structural issues. We can't handle our education system, and needless to say, but the implication here is that the rate of technological change creates a demand for continuous re-education, to use an ugly word. And I mean, think about, so this is just an example of how sort of institutionally pervasive technological change can be in terms of its demands on society. If we don't think about how we're going to continually train people in the face of continual technological change, then what does that mean for a perennially undertrained set of a workforce in a continually shifting employment environment?
Could that mean that these young people who are at their companies, the experts in social technology, could in 5 years find themselves being experts in something that's completely been overwhelmed, or
Sure, because if to follow up on what you said as just an example, if what I'm doing is I am taking content and transitioning it to other formats, that can be mechanized fairly easily. So while now there's a need for that, I would certainly be careful about that. And the more fundamental problem is we haven't really talked about augmented cognition yet, but augmented cognition is a whole series of technologies that are being developed by the military, by automobile manufacturers. And what we're basically doing is sort of an extension of Google. We're taking parts of human cognition and floating it into the technologies. So one of the deeper challenges.
Can you give an example?
An example is developing cars that drive themselves. And
that's happening in California. You can see this.
It's happening across the board, absolutely.
Drones that choose their targets.
Yeah, lethal autonomous robots. Which is always a good way to start a conversation at a party, by the way. one of the things to remember about all of these technologies is what they're doing is they're taking things that we have previously associated with human thinking and they're putting them in the technology. And if what you're doing is something like that, you can be rendered obsolete very quickly. So one of the challenges we've got is because Dan and I certainly don't know where these technologies are going, trying to understand what parts of human cognition are going to remain unique to humans even over the next 10 to 20 years.
Okay, and so if you were advising a young person, a college student, you might say, do not be the social technology guru at your company that's going to be an algorithm. What would you say? This is never going to be replaced.
I don't think.
Become an English major.
Yeah, right.
There's Joel challenging Garrison Keillor. Yeah, I think that there's no way we can say this will never be replaced. What we can say is that the more complex thinking that your job requires, communication, problem formulation, problem solving outside of domain boundaries, the better off you're going to be. But I think the theory.
Physicians, I mean, what?
Well,
physicians are history.
Yeah, I can build AI systems that can diagnose. Just like lawyers, I can build AI systems that'll do a lot of what lawyers do. Not everything. I mean, the high-class lawyers that you go buy in Washington, one of the reasons they get the money they do is because they do the law, but they also do lobbying. They also understand the politics. They understand who's going to be a player. Those kinds of things are very hard to replace. But they're also very difficult to obtain.
So this, I mean, this is an appeal to whatever the sort of the current version of liberal arts education is really in a lot of ways. I mean, I've talked to a number of high-tech executives who've said what they want, what they need is, in terms of choosing future leaders, is people who can handle complexity and uncertainty. And so that means critical thinking. So it's the same kind of unsatisfactory answer. It's not to be trained in a particular thing. The best way to deal with the uncertainties and the complexity is to be able to manage uncertainty and complexity, and that's kind of a critical thinking sort of a preparation rather than a particular skill. But it's not that satisfying when you're out there looking for your first job.
But so you're saying, well, obviously we know if you in law school that there used to be a good career ahead of you, not anymore necessarily. You're saying medical school, that could be a mistake? I mean, what?
Well,
medical school is
not a
different than law.
mistake. I mean, I think, so I would certainly not quit my job at this point. No. But I would be constantly trying to improve my intellectual capital. And there's two really critical points about that. The first is never trust anybody else to do that. I don't care what company you work for. I don't care what NGO you work for. I don't care if you work for never trust anybody else with your intellectual capital because it's all you got. So that's the first point. The second point is the gap, the line that we have drawn since the 50s and the 60s, probably as a result of increasing professionalism in a lot of developed economies, is between work and play and family. And I think all of those lines are collapsing. The idea that you're going to be competent at work, whatever your work is, without learning to learn at the same time you're working is simply, it's over, it's gone. You're going to have to be constantly putting yourself back through school. And you're going to have to do it because believe me, the people that purport to teach you by and large are incompetent to teach you this aspect of your life.
Let me ask another question. In the 9/11 issue of The New Yorker, George Packer wrote despairingly that the decade since 9/11 has destroyed even the possibility of a unified national narrative. Has technology contributed to this state of affairs, perhaps by creating ideological echo chambers? If so, what can we do about it?
I think the answer is yes and nothing. And the reason I say that is because if you think about it, what has driven the splits in American culture to be, Fox News Nation and New York Times Nation? What has driven it is not just the fact that we have very different narratives, Because if it was just very different narratives and they played against one another and one of them turned out to be stronger or better, it would win. What has driven it is the fact that we not only have many, many different narratives in this country right now, but there is more than enough information to support them all. It's an information-dense environment in our culture in a way that we have never had to deal with before. And so what we have is, in fact, a whole set of very powerful narratives that are self-reinforcing and that are ring-fenced, not through trivial events that go on every day, but through the very fundamental fact that we now have bubbled up so much information that they are all viable. It's like the revenge of the postmodernists. And that's why I say it's not going to go away, because it is not a phenomenon that is tied to any specific historical period. It's a phenomenon that is tied to the amount of information that's in our ambient environment.
So you can, if you want to believe that Gardasil causes mental retardation, you can find constant proof of it, and counter evidence doesn't have to.
I don't think there's anything new about this. I think the idea that there was ever any, in fact, I think there's an argument for its being healthy if we can manage it, because in fact, I'm much more worried about a uniform identity that's oppressive. And I think the other thing to be said is, you can look back as far as you want for despairing intellectual takes on technological change, okay? And my point isn't that technological change isn't destabilizing, shouldn't make us feel uncomfortable, doesn't threaten things that we think are important, but that's just like who we are. Democracy, liberty, they say, requires eternal vigilance. So does technology, and it's just it's just the thing we have to deal with. So I just see it as part of the narrative. It's not a new narrative.
That brings me to a question here.
Meta-narrative?
If the technology and data and interactions are owned and controlled by a small number of people who then have disproportionate power, how does democracy function? Sex is salacious, but what about censorship and privacy?
Yeah, I mean, I think this democracy is the key thing here, right? It's, I mean, the concern about privacy is nothing new. And by the way, if you lived in East Germany before any of these technologies, there was no privacy. The question here is, what are we going to be willing to ask the state to do in terms of protecting our civil rights that we think are important? So, this, again, it's not about predetermining where technology is going to go. It's about the extent to which we're willing to unleash democracy and protecting things that we think are important. So it's a political question, really. I don't see it as an innovation question.
Yeah, and I think that it's useful to remember when we talk about these deep values of ours that they're also historically contingent. I mean, if you lived in a village in the Middle Ages, you lived, if you were lucky, in a one-room house, and everything the family did occurred in that one room, and the entire village knew exactly what was going on in that one room. So privacy under those conditions was a fantasy, if anybody even thought about it. And so in some ways, a lot of what we're doing is we're reflecting a rate of change that may make us uncomfortable. But these are not new phenomena and new conditions. And we do negotiate. I mean, the reason that technologies are complex is not because widgets are complex. They can be complicated, they can be difficult, but it's not the widgets. It's the interaction of technologies, physical technologies, and psychology and culture, social issues. That's where it gets complex. And that's a continual process of negotiation to which we're all party.
I'm going to make this the last question. Please address the issue of forced self-human enhancement. And the example given is cochlear implants on deaf babies. Obviously, they don't give consent. The parents decide this is preferable to being deaf. You can go with this example or think of other examples.
Yeah, so I'll address it by saying this is the kind of thing that will be negotiated depending on the norms of a particular time. So let me give you not the cochlear implant example, but a different example. A friend of mine is a thalidomide, so seriously disabled in many ways.
He or she,
he was his mother
calls
took
himself
thalidomide.
a thalidomide.
Is the term. So he's got his legs and arms are malformed. He's committed to, as he says, I'm confined to my legs. He gets to be in a wheelchair, which he can leave. But the point is that he looks at things like abortion, which, in sort of liberal American politics, we have this cri de guerre, is that the word? Is this central issue as he sees himself as a full human being. If his problem had come along in an age of genetic testing and ultrasound, he probably would have been aborted. So the point I want to make about cochlear implants is these are issues that get discussed and dealt with at a particular time in a particular way. It's going to be different now than it is in the future. I do think there is a logic to technology that often does tend to trump ethical arguments. And it's going to be very difficult to take away from parents their right to make decisions about their kids if they see what you could disparagingly call a technological fix or what you could generously call a cure, given the sort of simplicity of the intervention. So, and Brad and I write about this, while we're very sympathetic with the notion of, say, the importance of maintaining cultural diversity around things like non-hearing cultures, we're equally sympathetic with a parent's decision to use a technology to keep their kid from perhaps getting disenfranchised. So again, no simple answers, but the key is to have the discussions out in the open so we know what's at stake.
Yeah, and I think to choose another example, choose vaccines. Most parents have their kids vaccinated. There's some that don't. One of the reasons why all of you in this audience have an approximate life expectancy of around 80 plus or minus. And if this were an audience in Zimbabwe, you'd have a life expectancy of about 35 or 40 plus or minus. One of the reasons is that we do things like enhance ourselves on a routine basis. The dialogues that go on around even accepted technologies like vaccines are still very powerful. And they reflect to some extent the postmodernism of our society, where there are many, many different attitudes and voices, all of which draw power from information that's in the ambient environment. I don't think that there's ever going to be any answers to any of this stuff, and I think it is possibly a failure mode to think in terms of answers. What we have is an extraordinary, beautiful, complicated, and difficult world. It's already here. It's the world that we're in. It's certainly the world that our kids are in. And I think learning how to deal with that as mature, sentient individuals is an extraordinary challenge that so far we have failed. And I think that's where we are. And it remains our choice as to whether we want to do better in future.
Well, Dan, Brad, thank you so much. I have to say, I'm a little concerned about you're both ending with there are no simple answers. That's what my column's all about, so don't try to put me out of business. I'm in the simple answer business. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to come here. I really appreciate it. Thank you.